never forget the night I spent in room 26. It wasn't supposed to be me in there. The hospital was full, and I was just a nurse working the night shift. But a storm knocked out power in half the building, and we had to shuffle patients around. Room 26 was the only one left, so I was told to sit with Mr. Langley, an elderly man recovering from surgery. "Bad luck," one of the other nurses whispered as I wheeled him in. That room gives me the creeps. I'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. Patients who stayed in room 26 always said the same thing. They saw a tall, black figure standing in the corner at night. Some said it hovered over their beds. Others swore it whispered their names. A few even claimed it was death itself, the Grim Reaper waiting to take them. I didn't believe in that kind of thing. Not then. The room was cold when I stepped inside, colder than the rest of the hospital. I figured it was the draft from the cracked window. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. But I shook it off. Hospitals always feel a little creepy at night. Mr. Langley was asleep within minutes. I sat in the chair by the door, flipping through patient charts, trying to ignore the strange hush that settled over the room. No hum of machines, no distant buzz of voices, just silence, thick and heavy. It started with a sound, a faint, low rasp, like someone breathing right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. "Just your imagination," I whispered to myself, forcing a laugh. But the laugh died in my throat when I turned back. The corner of the room was darker than before. Pitch black, like the shadows had thickened into something solid. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then it moved. A tall, black figure stepped out of the corner, its shape stretching impossibly high, its edges blurring into the darkness. No face, no features, just emptiness where a head should have been. I froze, my heart pounding so loud it felt like the figure could hear it. It didn't walk, didn't glide. It just shifted, closer and closer to Mr. Langley's bed. "Hey!" My voice came out shaky, barely a whisper. "Who's there?" No response. The figure stopped at the foot of the bed, looming over the old man. I wanted to move, to scream, to grab Mr. Langley and run. But I couldn't. It was like my body had turned to stone. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure leaned down, its shadow stretching over Mr. Langley. A whisper filled the room, soft and chilling, though I couldn't make out the words. Mr. Langley stirred, his eyes fluttering open. His gaze locked on the figure, and he smiled. "No," I whispered, my voice breaking. "What are you?" Before I could finish, the figure straightened. It turned, just slightly as if looking at me, and then it was gone. The shadows melted away, leaving the corner as empty as it had been before. I ran to Mr. Langley's side, shaking his shoulder, but he didn't wake up. He didn't move. He was gone, his smile still frozen on his face. I never told anyone what I saw that night. Who would believe me? But now, whenever I walk past room 26, I feel it, like something's watching, waiting, and I wonder who the figure will come for next. My first night shift as a nurse started like any other job, a little nervous, a little excited. It was a quiet hospital, tucked away on the edge of town. The halls smelled of antiseptic, and the hum of machines filled the air. "You'll be fine," the head nurse said with a tired smile as she handed me the night report. "Just keep an eye on Ward C. They get restless at night." Restless. That word stuck with me as I walked the dimly lit corridors. Ward C was at the far end of the hospital, a small wing with only 4 patients. The lights flickered as I approached, making shadows stretch and twist on the walls. I shook off the unease. It was just nerves. First nights are always weird, right? The first patient, Mr. Green, was asleep when I checked on him. His chart said he'd had a stroke and was nonverbal. He lay perfectly still, his breathing shallow but steady. The second room belonged to Mrs. Bell. She was propped up in bed, staring out the window. Her chart mentioned confusion and advanced dementia. "Good evening, Mrs. Bell," I said softly. She didn't turn to look at me. "He's here again," she whispered, her voice so faint I almost missed it. "Who's here?" I asked, glancing over my shoulder. The hall was empty. She didn't answer, just kept staring at something beyond the glass, her lips moving silently. I moved on to the third room. That's when things started to get strange. The bed was empty. I frowned and double-checked the chart. A man named Mr. Davies was supposed to be there, recovering from a fall. I looked around the room, expecting to find him in the chair or the bathroom, but it was as if he'd vanished. As I stepped back into the hall, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air seemed heavier, colder. That's when I saw her. A little girl, no older than 10, standing at the end of the corridor. Her hair was tangled, and her hospital gown hung loosely on her thin frame. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" I asked, taking a step toward her. She didn't move. Her eyes were dark, almost too dark, and fixed on me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "Where are your parents?" I asked, my voice shaking. She tilted her head, as if considering my question. Then she smiled, a cold, hollow smile that didn't reach her eyes, and disappeared. Not walked away, not ran. Just vanished. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The lights flickered again, and suddenly the ward felt alive. The soft hum of machines turned into whispers, faint and distant but growing louder. I couldn't make out the words, but they were everywhere, surrounding me. I ran back to Mrs. Bell's room, hoping to find comfort in another human being, but when I stepped inside, her bed was empty too. No, not just empty. The bed looked untouched, like no one had been there at all. A sound behind me made me spin around. Mr. Green's door was open, though I was sure I'd closed it earlier. His room was pitch black, but I could hear breathing, deep, labored, and wrong. I wanted to run, to get out of that place, but my legs wouldn't move. "Help me," a voice rasped from inside the dark room. I forced myself to step closer, peering into the shadows. And that's when I saw him. Mr. Green was standing, though his chart said he couldn't walk. His head hung low, his face hidden, but his body was twisted at an unnatural angle. "Help me," he said again, lifting his head. His eyes were gone, just hollow sockets staring into nothingness. I screamed and bolted for the exit. When I told the head nurse what happened, she just sighed. "Ward C," she said, shaking her head. "We don't use that wing anymore. Those patients, they've been dead for years." I never went back, but sometimes late at night I still hear whispers, and I know they're calling me back. The night in room 306. What I thought would be a simple checkup turned into something else entirely. The doctor didn't like my blood pressure or something. I wasn't really paying attention. Next thing I knew, I was being admitted. "Just for observation," they said. One night. I wasn't worried at first. The room was clean, the bed stiff but manageable. The nurse, a kind woman with tired eyes, told me to get some rest. "We'll check on you throughout the night," she said. As the hours passed, the hospital grew quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes every small sound feel enormous. Around midnight, I heard the first whisper. At first, I thought it was coming from the hall, a nurse giving instructions, or maybe someone on a late-night phone call, but it wasn't. The sound seemed to float, echoing faintly in the room. "Help." I sat up, straining my ears. The whisper was faint, almost like the wind. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, and tried to sleep. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, though still too faint to make out fully. It was like someone was standing right outside my room, murmuring just out of reach. I pressed the call button. The nurse came in, her face calm but a little annoyed. "I keep hearing whispers," I said. "Is there someone in the hall?" She frowned. "No one's out there. It's been quiet all night." I nodded, feeling foolish. But the moment she left, the whispers started again. This time they sounded closer. I sat frozen in bed, clutching the scratchy blanket. My eyes darted around the room, but everything looked normal. The faint glow of the machines, the sterile white walls, the closed door. Then came the sound of footsteps. Soft, shuffling steps like someone dragging their feet across the floor. They started at the far end of the hall and grew louder, closer. I stared at the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The footsteps stopped just outside my room. "Hello?" I whispered. No answer. The door didn't open, but I swear I saw the handle move, just the slightest twitch. My breathing quickened as I stared, waiting for something, but nothing happened. I didn't sleep after that. Every time I closed my eyes, the whispers came back, louder and closer, until they seemed to come from the very walls around me. The longest night of my life finally ended when the sun rose. The whispers stopped, the air lightened, and the nurses bustled in with their cheerful morning chatter. When the doctor came in to discharge me, I asked him if anything strange ever happened in the hospital at night. He hesitated, then gave a small, uneasy smile. "Patients in that wing sometimes say they hear things," he admitted, "but it's probably just the old pipes." I didn't believe him. As I left the hospital, I glanced back at the window of room 306. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move behind the curtain. I didn't wait to see more. After Dr. Hamilton died, the West Wing of the hospital felt different. Everyone said it was just grief playing tricks on us. He had been a brilliant surgeon, respected and kind. But now, his absence felt more than just physical. It was like the walls remembered him. I work night shifts at the hospital. It's quiet, usually just the hum of machines and the occasional moan from patients. But after Hamilton passed, things started happening in the West Wing. Patients whispered about a pale doctor who came into their rooms late at night. He doesn't speak, one old woman told me, gripping my arm with bony fingers. He just stares, his lips move, but no sound comes out. I smiled, told her she must have dreamed it. But the next night, another patient said the same thing. And another. I tried to brush it off, but then I started noticing strange things myself. The lights in the West Wing flickered more than usual. The air felt colder, heavier, like it was pressing down on you. And sometimes in the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a shadow. One night, I was making my rounds when I heard it, a soft, dragging sound, like footsteps that didn't quite lift off the ground. My heart pounded. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But the sound grew louder, closer. I turned the corner and froze. There he was, a tall, pale figure in a white coat standing at the end of the hallway. His back was to me, but I could see his head tilting slightly, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. He turned slowly and my stomach dropped. It was Dr. Hamilton. But it wasn't. His face was ashen, his eyes hollow, and his lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. He raised a hand, pointing toward me, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The figure didn't move, just stared with those empty eyes. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the brightly lit nurse's station. When I told the others, they laughed nervously, saying I must have been tired, but I could see it in their eyes. They were scared too. The next night, I stayed far away from the West Wing, but around 3 a.m., the intercom crackled to life. A voice, faint and distorted, whispered my name. "Claire." I stared at the speaker, frozen. The voice came again, louder this time. "Claire, help me." It sounded just like Dr. Hamilton. I don't go near the West Wing anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the soft shuffle of footsteps, and sometimes I feel a cold hand brush against my arm. The ghost girl appeared the moment the clock struck midnight. It was my first night shift in the ICU, and I was already on edge. The unit was too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I tried to focus on my tasks, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Then I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the hallway, near the last bed. A little girl no older than 7 or 8, wearing a white dress that looked like it belonged in another time. Her hair hung in dark, tangled strands around her pale face, and she wasn't supposed to be there. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. She didn't move. She just stared at me with wide, dark eyes that seemed to pull me in. I blinked, and she was gone. I laughed nervously to myself. "You're just tired," I muttered, trying to brush it off. But as the night went on, strange things started happening. The first was the lights. One by one, they began flickering, as if the hospital's wiring had suddenly gone haywire. I tried to ignore it, but then the monitors in room 4 started beeping like crazy. I rushed in, expecting to find the patient in distress, but he was sound asleep, his vitals perfectly normal. The beeping stopped the moment I stepped inside. That's when I saw her again. She was standing at the foot of the patient's bed, her hands clasped in front of her. "You need to leave," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She tilted her head like she didn't understand, and then she smiled. Every monitor in the room went off at once, the piercing alarms echoing through the ICU. I spun around, frantically pressing buttons to silence them. But when I turned back, she was gone. For the next few hours, she followed me everywhere. I'd catch glimpses of her in the reflections of the monitors, standing just behind me. I'd hear the soft patter of bare feet on the tile floor, though no one was there when I looked. Supplies would vanish from my cart, only to reappear in places I hadn't been. And the whispers. Soft, almost inaudible, but constant. My name, over and over, as if carried on a breeze I couldn't feel. By 3 a.m., I was shaking so badly I could barely hold a clipboard. Then came the worst part. I was in the break room, trying to catch my breath, when the coffee maker turned on by itself. The smell of burnt coffee filled the air as steam hissed and sputtered. I stood frozen, watching it drip into an empty cup, and then I felt it. A cold, tiny hand on my arm. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and there she was, standing right next to me, so close I could see the faint outlines of veins beneath her pale skin. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, she said, "You shouldn't be here." I ran. I don't remember much after that. I think I made it through the rest of the shift on autopilot, avoiding the ICU as much as possible. When the morning light finally poured through the windows, the air felt lighter, the shadows less menacing. But I knew I couldn't stay. I quit the night shift that day. I still wonder who she was, the ghost girl in the white dress. A patient who didn't make it? A lost soul trapped in the hospital's walls? I don't know. But I'll never forget her, or the cold touch of her hand. The phantom calls from room 202. I used to work night shifts at an old hospital. It was quiet most of the time. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you notice every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows. But nothing ever prepared me for the calls from room 202. Room 202 had been empty for months. They closed it off after a patient passed away there. An old woman who had spent her last days delirious, rambling about keeping the babies safe. No one wanted to talk about it, but you could feel it in the air. That room carried a heaviness, like the walls were holding on to something. The first time the phone rang from room 202, I thought it was a mistake. It was 2 a.m., and the red light on the switchboard blinked. 202, the display read. I picked up the receiver, expecting silence or maybe static, but instead I heard a faint, trembling voice. "Hello." It was an old woman. Her words were slow, each one dripping with an eerie calm. "They're crying again. The babies, they're crying. You must help them." I froze. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't answer. Instead, the sound of babies crying filled the line, soft at first, then louder, shrill, like they were screaming. It was unbearable, echoing in my ears. "Who is this?" I asked again, but the line went dead. I tried to convince myself it was a prank. Maybe some crossed wires or a glitch in the system, but deep down, I knew better. The calls didn't stop. Every few nights, the phone would ring, always at the same time. 2 a.m. Each time, it was the same. The old woman, calm and distant, talking about the babies. "They're cold," she said once. "So cold." I tried to warm them, but they just keep crying. Another time, she whispered, "Don't let them in. If you let them in, they'll never leave." The crying on the line got worse, more desperate. Sometimes I thought I heard other sounds in the background, soft, muffled thuds like footsteps and the faint creak of a rocking chair. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. After the third call that week, I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to room 202. The hallway was silent, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. When I reached the door, I hesitated. The air felt heavy, thick, like I was walking through water. I pushed the door open, and the flashlight beam cut through the darkness. The room was empty, the bed was stripped, the walls bare. But the air, it felt alive, buzzing with something I couldn't see. Then I saw it, the phone on the bedside table. It was old, dusty, disconnected. The cord dangled loose, cut clean at the end. And yet, as I stared at it, the phone rang. The sharp, jarring sound made me jump. My hand trembled as I reached for the receiver. I pressed it to my ear, and the old woman's voice whispered, "They're here." The baby's cries erupted in the background, louder than ever, a deafening, heart-wrenching chorus. The sound was so overwhelming, I dropped the phone and stumbled back. The crying didn't stop. It filled the room, surrounding me, choking the air. I ran. I never went near room 202 again. No one did. They sealed it off a month later, claiming renovations. But even now, on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of babies crying through the walls. The Phantom Pediatrician. I'll never forget this experience from my early days as a pediatric nurse. Working in one of the oldest wings of the hospital during the night shift, I witnessed something that still puzzles me to this day. A phantom pediatrician. It was a quiet night, or as quiet as a pediatric ward could be. The air was heavy, with the faint beeping of monitors and the soft murmurs of restless children. I had just finished checking on the patients, making sure they were comfortable. Most were asleep, though a few stirred in their beds, too ill to rest peacefully. The wing I worked in was old, older than most of the hospital. The paint on the walls was faded, and the floors creaked, no matter how carefully you walked. Some of the other nurses joked about the place being haunted, but I never paid it much attention. That night, I was sitting at the nurses' station, updating charts. The fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, something I'd gotten used to. Around 2 a.m., I heard soft footsteps echoing down the hallway. I glanced up, expecting to see one of the doctors making their rounds. Instead, a man appeared, walking toward me with a purposeful stride. He wore an old-fashioned white coat, the kind I'd only seen in black and white photos from decades ago. A stethoscope hung around his neck, and a clipboard was tucked under his arm. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Good evening," I replied, confused. I didn't recognize him, and something about his appearance felt out of place. "Can I help you?" He smiled, a warm yet strange smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm Dr. Morgan. I'm here to check on the children in room 12. Room 12 housed a little boy named Daniel, who had been admitted earlier that week for a severe respiratory infection. His condition had been touch and go, and I felt a surge of relief knowing a doctor was checking on him." "Of course," I said, nodding. Dr. Morgan walked past me, his footsteps unnervingly silent now, despite the creaky floors. I watched as he entered room 12. The door didn't even squeak like it usually did. Something about the interaction left me uneasy. I grabbed the roster of on-call staff to see if there was a Dr. Morgan listed. There wasn't. Heart pounding, I got up and hurried to room 12. The door was slightly ajar, and I peeked inside. Dr. Morgan was standing by Daniel's bed, leaning over the boy and murmuring softly. Daniel, who had been struggling to breathe all night, looked peaceful now, almost as if he were smiling in his sleep. I stepped inside. "Dr. Morgan?" I asked, my voice trembling. He turned to me, his expression calm but unreadable. "The boy will be fine," he said. "He just needed a little help." Before I could respond, he walked past me, his presence like a cool breeze brushing my arm. I turned to follow him out, but when I reached the hallway, he was gone. The corridor stretched empty, the faint hum of the hospital the only sound. I ran back to the nurse's station and called the on-call doctor. When he arrived, I told him what had happened. He dismissed my story with nervous laugh, saying I was probably overtired. But when we checked on Daniel, the boy's condition had drastically improved. His oxygen levels were normal and his fever had broken. The next day, I mentioned Dr. Morgan to one of the older nurses. Her face went pale. "Dr. Morgan?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was a pediatrician here, 30 years ago. He died in this wing while trying to save a patient during a fire." I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was a trick of the mind. But every time I think about that phantom pediatrician, I can't shake the feeling that he's still here watching over the children in the old wing, and maybe, just maybe, he saved Daniel. Third night. I promised myself I would never go back to that hospital again. Even now, as I sit in the dim light of my living room, my hands tremble. The memory of what happened to her, to us, on the third night chills me more than the November wind howling outside. Her name was Sarah. She was my sister, my best friend. We were closer than most siblings, bonded by years of shared laughter, secrets, and struggles. When she was admitted to the hospital, I stayed by her side as much as I could. The doctors said it was pneumonia, but her pale skin and sunken eyes told me something worse was happening. The first night was uneventful, quiet except for the steady hum of machines around her bed. I sat in the chair by the window, flipping through a magazine I wasn't reading, while Sarah slept fitfully. Occasionally, she'd mumble in her sleep, but I couldn't make out the words. The second night, she began talking in her sleep. At first, it was soft whispers, just her name and fragments of sentences. But by midnight, the whispers turned to frantic muttering. I leaned in closer, trying to catch what she was saying. "It's coming," she murmured. Her lips barely moved, but her voice was clear. "It's coming." I asked, my voice shaking. Her eyes flew open, wide and glassy, staring at something just past my shoulder. I turned quickly, but the room was empty, save for the shadows cast by the dim overhead light. "It's coming," she repeated, louder this time. Then, just as suddenly as she'd woken, she slumped back into the pillows, her breathing shallow but steady. I barely slept that night, the sense of something unseen pressing against my chest. By the third night, I was running on coffee and nerves. Sarah had been unusually quiet all day, barely speaking when awake, and she hadn't complained when the nurses brought in her meals, which she usually hated. It was as though she'd retreated somewhere deep inside herself. I stayed by her bed again, this time gripping her hand tightly. The night dragged on, and at around 2 a.m., the hospital felt impossibly still. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound. It wasn't coming from the door or the window, but from the ceiling. I looked up, squinting at the tiled surface above. The sound grew louder, sharper, like nails dragging against wood. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't just scratching, it was moving. The noise traveled from one corner of the room to the other, stopping directly above Sarah's bed. She opened her eyes then, staring straight at the ceiling. "It's here," she whispered. Before I could respond, the light flickered violently and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the machines monitoring Sarah's vitals. Their beeping grew erratic, faster and faster, until they suddenly stopped. "Sarah!" I shouted, shaking her shoulders. She didn't move. Then I felt it, cold, ice-cold air brushing the back of my neck. I turned slowly, heart pounding, and saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its face a shifting blur of shadows. It loomed over Sarah, its claw-like hand reaching out for her. "No!" I screamed, lunging forward. But as I did, the thing turned its head to me. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its gaze, sharp and burning. "You can't save her," it hissed, its voice like dead leaves scraping across pavement. And then it was gone. The lights came back on. The machines beeped steadily again. Sarah lay still, her chest rising and falling as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. The next morning, the doctors told me she was improving, that she'd likely recover. But Sarah never woke up. Her body was alive, but her mind, her soul, was gone. I left the hospital that day and swore I'd never go back, because I know it's still there, waiting, watching, and I know it wasn't finished with her.